Hello, and we're back with one of our videos here. We are right at the top end of Regent Street, here by the All Souls Church. And today we're going to talk a little bit about John Nash, in particular, George IV, and their big joint project together of building Regent Street, which was one of the most prominent shopping streets in London at the time, and it still is today. So that is the topic of our video, but we can just point out that the BBC happens to be here as well, their headquarters, and sometimes they broadcast from in here, from the church, which is quite interesting. I guess it adds a particular acoustic level to be broadcasting from in here, from this conservative Anglican church. But we'll just focus a bit more on the All Souls Church here, because this is actually the only building that was originally designed by John Nash that remains along this Regent Street strip. Otherwise, all the other buildings have been replaced. A lot of them were replaced in around 1920. The rest of them were bombed during the Blitz. So this is actually the only building that survived the Blitz, and then they were rebuilt afterwards. So today we're talking a little bit about this fella here, the royal architect of the Regency period, and quickly became the favorite architect of George IV, the Prince Regent. He took over the reins of his father's leadership, George III, when he fell into his final and conclusive spell of madness and sickness, and adopted the name and the title, the Prince Regent, which is why the street here, that was his big project, is named Regent Street, and why we call it the Regency period. Now, the former royal architect had actually been killed in 1813, James Wyatt, which paved the way for John Nash to make his comeback to success. He had actually suffered a little bit of economic disaster himself, and had become bankrupt for various reasons, including, but not limited to, his wife's lavish hat shopping, which apparently amounted to about £300 a month at least. This was his grand chance to land himself in high society in London again and really put his mark on London, add something new to the West End. And that was pretty much Regent Street, which we are going to go down. But he started with this church here, actually, which was finished in 1823. And then consecrated in 1824. That was just a year before the street itself was open to the public. And as I already mentioned, it's the only surviving building that was actually designed by John Nash. So it gives you a nice idea of the Regency style looking at All Souls Church. It's also put at a bit of an awkward angle here, because Regent Street was meant to connect Carlton House, which we'll get to down at the end, and it was meant to connect that with Regent's Park, where the Prince Regent was planning to build himself a new palace, Regent's Palace, right? But if you ever go up here yourself, you'll notice it kind of goes off at an awkward angle to the west, because there was the already existing Portland Place. So in a sense, you could consider this the end of Regent Street, and then it awkwardly juts off to Portland Place, which finally leads you up to Regent's Park. It's also why in December, when we got the Christmas lights, they finish here. So in a sense, the Christmas lights end here and they begin all the way down at Carlton House, sort of following the spirit of the original design of Regent Street. And we'll continue down Regent Street at this moment. Okay, so here we are at Oxford Circus, once known as Regent Oxford Circus. This was designed as part of the Regency scheme to connect the older Oxford Street with Regent Street. So from the get-go, it was planned to be a major junction in the heart of shopping around here. When John Nash first laid out the plans for the Prince Regent in 1813, that was part of the whole scheme. because Oxford Street already existed as a major thoroughfare, but it wasn't necessarily as geared towards shopping as it later became when Regent Street came about as well. But it has actually been an old Roman road here. So Oxford Street preceded Regent Street by a much, much longer time. It was known as the Via Trinobentina, which was like a main Roman road thoroughfare that connected Essex with Hampshire. And then it cut through London at this point. Although in the Roman period, this would not have been part of London. So this would have been almost a countryside road. Well, that's besides the point. What I wanted to show here as well is the one of the main purposes of Regent Street. Because as we've already covered, the whole point was to connect Carlton Palace, Carlton House, with the new palace being designed in Regent's Park, and Regent's Park as well. So George IV wanted a royal thoroughfare that could serve as a shopping street at the same time. But there was another less stated purpose behind Regent Street, and that was to slice up the West End and make a bit of a dividing line between the fancy Mayfair and the, let's say, dingy and ill-regarded Soho. And you can actually see that slice right here. So Mayfair is over there, and Soho is right here. And you won't be able to tell today because they're both fairly chic and fancy. Mayfair is still more exclusive than Soho, but still, they're still considered pretty high-end. But back in the 1800s, back in the 19th century, Soho was considered dreadful, right? It was a place you would go for cheap entertainment. And when I say cheap entertainment, I'm talking, of course, of gambling dens, later on opium dens as well, brothels. It was all the sordid business of London was going on in Soho, right? Mayfair was, in the Regency period, being developed to be a fancy new living quarters for people that could afford to live close to the Prince Regent and who would later become the king. So they wanted to make a bit of a buffer zone between Mayfair and Soho. Maybe not too far away, so the fine gentlemen of Mayfair could still go in and enjoy Soho at their own leisure, which is a bit sort of the more sordid history here of Regent Street. But that was one of the purposes it was built. Just as a bit of a side note, we've got 9 Conduit Street here, and we mentioned the architect that had been killed. He was killed in an accident, by the way, involving a carriage, which then paved the way for John Nash to become the royal architect and the Prince Regent's new favorite. So that previous royal architect, James Wyatt, actually designed this townhouse here. It's currently a modern European fusion restaurant that opened its doors in the early 2000s. Well, this townhouse has actually been the host of many a famous society. It's had the RIBA, the acronym for them is RIBA, the Royal Architects Society. They used to have their headquarters here. The suffragettes even used it on a few occasions. And it's been used by many other societies and groups ever since. But now, since the early 2000s, it's become a luxury restaurant here in pretty much the most luxurious area in Mayfair. But we're going to dip back into Regent Street here. I just wanted to mention something built by the previous royal architects. So we've also got Hamleys here, a later addition to Regent Street. About 50 years later, in 1881, is when they opened the flagship store of Hamleys, which is 5 floors of a crazy toy bonanza. And it has been pretty much since 1881. At that time, Hamleys had become a juggernaut in the Victorian Empire within toys. But it was actually established much earlier, in 1760 by William Hamley. That's where the name comes from. Although it would only take up the name later on, remembering the one who started it all, William Hamley, by calling it Hamley's. He originally called his little toy store Noah's Ark. So it certainly changed over time. But then it became the biggest toy store in the world at the time. And these days, arguably, probably the most famous toy store, known for its performers in particular, who we've had the pleasure of watching a little bit. Now, the building itself was actually, well, along with all of Regent Street here, was badly bombed during the Blitz. And this building was bombed no less than 5 times. But they still operated here. And you still had workers during the Blitz from Hamleys rushing out to distribute toys and gifts for children, especially in the Christmas period during the Blitz. Many of them would go down to Piccadilly Circus, which we're making our way down to now, to distribute toys in the biggest bomb shelter around here in the underground of Piccadilly Circus. But it's just a nice little mention to have Hamleys as we go down along, added to the splendor of Regent Street. And Regent Street was already a place to meet and have social activities and shopping since it opened to the public in 1825. Okay, so now we've come down almost to the end of Regent Street, or at least Regent Street proper. But it's interesting, you can see that very dramatic bend here. That was the result of, let's say, a dilemma that John Nash had to solve at the Prince Regent. Because originally they wanted the road to go straight, all the way down to Carlton House. Unfortunately, there were lots of landholdings, especially around St. James's Palace, and noble landowners there, who were disagreeing towards that plan. And the main problem they encountered was that land ownership. They refused to sell the land for Regent Street to go straight down as they wanted. So they had to make a bit of a compromise and have Regent Street curve like this here, going out to Piccadilly Circus instead. And then they built Lower Regent Street, which continued from Piccadilly Circus to go down to Carlton House as intended. So this, you can see, is really come about from a dispute of land ownership. But it did afford an opportunity for John Nash to build this here, which is unfortunately covered up in a lot of scaffolding right in the year of our Lord 2026 when we're here. But this is the Quadrant, and the Quadrant became an opportunity for John Nash to flex his architectural muscles, if you will, and also improve on that buffer zone that I mentioned before of separating Soho from the more lavish Mayfair. So it became a major sort of shopping wedge, and it is shaped a little bit like a cheese wedge if you look at it up from the top, accommodating for this bend here in the road. So it became more of a wall to keep Soho safely on the other side, basically. And it had arcades going, lavish shopping arcades going through it, of which there's one today that sort of pays homage to that past. It did have a problem though. It had even greater colonnades, which have not been restored today. But you look at all these neoclassical buildings, they're all basically restored with John Nash's original architectural design in mind. So there's been a fairly faithful job done here in recreating the Regency neoclassicism of these buildings. And they're all Grade 2 heritage listed buildings. So it's actually illegal and against the law to build any buildings that are taller than these buildings here, interestingly enough. But they did have a problem, and there's one thing that they didn't restore. That was the colonnades. They had like these big archways and colonnades, especially around the Quadrant here. Unfortunately, it attracted a lot of sex workers from Soho who were lounging around in the colonnades and making it very hard as a clothes merchant or any other merchant around here to ply their trade, because it became sort of associated with prostitution instead of shopping. So they actually demolished those colonnades to try and dissuade the prostitutes from hanging around here. So that gives you sort of a nice idea about the tense relationship between shopping and Soho right on the other side. Okay, as you can see here, we got the Quartern Arcade still today. So almost exactly 200 years later, there's still massive shopping avenues here. It's still all about shopping in the Quartern, which I think is pretty fascinating. We've managed to consistently keep it about the same thing here. Because, yeah, as we remember, it was opened in roughly around 1825 to 1826. Now we're in 2026. So there you go, 200 years of shopping galore. Now, if we look over here, you can see the Cafe Royal as well. A very famous cafe, especially famous for all the writers that have frequented it. The most famous one being Oscar Wilde. The grill bar, which is inside, is known as the Oscar Wilde Bar today. You've also had H.G. Wells frequenting it, Virginia Woolf, amongst others, Rudyard Kipling as well. There's many famous names associated with Cafe Royal. So that's always been a bit of a fancy cafe and hotel to attend here. We're just going to go down to Piccadilly Circus now and come towards the end of Regent Street proper before we make our way down to Lower Regent Street, or as it's called today, Regent Street St. James's. Right, so we got this nice little timetable here, Regent Street, provided to us by the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate, of course, owns most of the land around here. So it is owned by the royal family, essentially. And one thing that Regent Street is particularly famous for today is its Christmas lights, which go the whole length that we've walked here today from All Souls Church all the way down to here. Then it breaks for a little bit, and then it continues down Regent Street, St. James's, what was known as Lower Regent Street. Because remember, the original plan was Regent Street went all the way down to Carlton House. They had to compromise and slice it up here into two streets coming out to Piccadilly Circus. You can actually see we got the handy date here of 1954 is when the first Christmas lights got up. And they apparently got up because of a scathing article in the Daily Telegraph complaining that London was too gloomy and dreary in the Christmas season. So Regent Street was actually the first street in London to see to it to try and change that. So in 1954, in a initiative with the local shop owners, with the Crown Estate and with Westminster Council, they decided to try and light up the whole street in spectacular street lights. And that gave birth to a tradition we've celebrated ever since. So every December, we now have, usually it's the spirit of Christmas. Sometimes it's different themes. But the first theme was Spirit of Christmas, which is essentially a long line of glowing angels hanging all the way down Regent Street. 30 angels in total. And for the last 10 years, we've had that same theme, which was also the theme that began in 1954. So that is one tradition that's been kept alive ever since. And the reason the angels, they continue down the next street, that is because Regent Street was meant to go all the way down there. So we'll go down to Lower Regent Street now. Okay, so a little side note here. If you're ever in London, it's always a nice surprise if you decide to look up. You'll see a lot of interesting statues and generally lots of interesting architecture, especially in the West End. We got an example of Britannia up there, which is, you'll find her atop a lot of buildings here in London. She's a bit of an adopted mythological figure. Of course, she's taken from Athena, but she's usually added a few unique attributes, as we call them. Attributes are elements or items of gods that makes them recognizable. And in her case, she, this one here has a Union Jack for her shield, and she often has a trident as well when you find her here, because Britannia also symbolizes naval control. So it's almost like she's got Poseidon's trident along with being another version of Athena. So she's a bit of a British adopted mythological figure. Okay, so now we are nearly at where Regent Street was meant to end. We are right here at what's called Waterloo Place today. We are right before the great memorial to the Crimean War. There's lots of references to war figures around here these days. We're going to see the Grand Old Duke of York very shortly. But this is essentially where the road was meant to end. A little bit further there to the right, it was meant to come all the way down to Carlton House, which is what is called Carlton Terrace today. And it was a short-lived palace dreamt up by George IV in all his opulence, which didn't last very long because the king quickly got bored with his own palace. And just when they had finished Regent Street and the palace was more or less finished, he was unsatisfied with Carlton House and decided to demolish it. And most of it was used to actually build Buckingham Palace today and Windsor Castle. So, yeah, not a lot of it, well, practically nothing of the original Carlton House remains, but we are going to see the new Carlton Terrace that was built in its stead, along with the Grand Old Duke of York statue and the steps, which were actually part of the whole Regent Street design, the steps that would connect Regent Street with the Mall, with the Coronation Road and St. James's Park. And now we are at the end, where Regent Street was meant to take you to Carlton House here. Now, as I mentioned, it was demolished, specifically demolished in 1826, so nothing of it remains, and it was replaced by these terraced buildings called Carlton Terrace today. And then the steps here were put in as well. The column was put later after the king's death in the 1830s, 1836. You had a column dedicated to his younger brother, to George's younger brother, Frederick II, who was the main general of the British infantry and the British army. Now, Carlton House was a rather lavish palace that was originally rebuilt. It was a townhouse here that was originally rebuilt by George IV and with a different architect, Henry Holland. And they rebuilt most of it from around the 1780s. Made it a very big, lavish palace. And it got even bigger and bigger. But at the time they finished Regent Street, he was unsatisfied with the palace and decided to demolish it and move into Buckingham Palace instead. And that would be the inciting event, if you will, eventually turning Buckingham Palace into the royal residence. Because George IV had already started moving in there. It was Queen Victoria after him who made it official and finally moved into Buckingham Palace. But it was being turned into a home by the preceding king. Now, George IV, he wasn't really a money man, and not much of a politician either. He tended not to worry so much about the cost of things, which ended with him accruing quite a large debt. Actually, a debt of about £20 million in our money today. And it certainly didn't help that he destroyed and demolished palaces willy-nilly and used them to build even bigger palaces. But there was one famous writer who came here to visit the king in his palace, Carlton House, when it was still around. It was Jane Austen. Jane Austen actually came here on the king's invitation. And she was not impressed. At least she was not impressed with him. She was on the side of his estranged wife. His wife, who he didn't have the best relationship with because he was also a nefarious adulterer and had many mistresses. So she famously declared, well, I'm on the side of her, but I hate her husband. So there you go. That was a little bit of a clash of two figures. And a little bit like his brother, they both had money issues. So his brother kind of had the same disposition to money, wasted loads of money on gambling attempts that didn't pan out, which is what gave rise to the popular myth that they had to install his column here for Frederick II to make sure that his creditors couldn't come and melt down his statue for profit, interestingly enough, because he was so much in debt. But he was a staunch supporter of George IV regardless. And say what you will about George IV, he might have been a very unpopular monarch, both in his own time and in our time. He was actually voted through a poll by English Heritage to be the most useless monarch in English history. However, we can thank him for a few things, especially a lot of the design of Buckingham Palace today came about on his behest, along with Windsor Castle and many other palatial residences around. And he was a lavish supporter of the arts in general. So he was a great patron of the arts, and it helped to really pave the way for Regency art in particular, no matter how much it cost. His wife famously compared him to a hairdresser and said the king would have been a great hairdresser because he had a great sense of style, a great aesthetic sense, but maybe not the best sense for ruling a country necessarily. This is partly the reason why the nursery rhyme, you've probably heard that one before, Georgie Porgy eats a pie, that came about making fun of him. And since he was Prince of Wales before he became king, he was often known as the Prince of Wales, just adding a little H in there. So that's just giving you an idea of what sort of figure he was. But I think it's fair to give him some credit as well. And we can certainly credit him for designing Regent Street, which we still have today.